And welcome to MC and Mad Talk Civil War, episode 29, The End Game. That's right. Let's skip the whole part where Lee surrenders and get right to where Lincoln's brains are on the theater wall. Anyway, I'm here as usual with MC. I'm just kidding. All right. They make an orderly retreat out of Richmond.
Well,
as long as you call orderly, as in they burn half the city down.
Well, before we get to that, let's take a look at some things here, okay? Because there's certain things that happen that create the siege, and I think that we should probably talk about that. And that's not the one I wanted. Is this the one I wanted? Yes, this is the one I wanted. Okay, let me share this. There, and what you're looking at is what they're calling here the Second Battle of Petersburg, right? And this was an attempt, all right, as the pivot. What Lee was expecting was that in the wilderness after Cold Harbor, that Grant would pivot actually west, northwest around the other side of Petersburg, or Richmond rather. Instead, he moved immediately south and across the river, all right, and caught Lee actually by surprise. Unfortunately, his men dallied at the river instead of pressing on like he wanted, and as a result, Lee was able to rush reinforcements along this railroad line, all right, to set up a stop to prevent the taking of Petersburg. Now, why was Petersburg important? Petersburg's important because there's several major railed things that feed Richmond going through Petersburg. So he has to hold Petersburg because this battle gets repulsed, because Burnside and Mott are unable to actually force into Petersburg into the defenses. They have to settle down to a siege. Okay, and of course the siege, it wears on. It wears on. This begins, as you can see here, right after June and goes all the way in through July, right, and really all the way into the beginning of next year. That's how long they stay in siege. Now, what's happening here? Okay, what's happening is the Unionists have come out and said, okay, let's try and see what we can do. Their first big attempt turns out to be this, which is the Battle of the Crater. Let's see if the map here is a little better. We'll pull this up.
Oh, that's right. That's where they dig a tunnel, right? And they blow up a shit ton of TNT, right?
They pack an area to try and blow open a hole in the line here, all right, with TNT and explosives, right? They use Pennsylvania coal miners, and they dig a massive underground thing. And the way they do it with everything is actually very inventive. All right, I mean, they use some really inventive mining techniques to actually get under there. Now, the Southern forces were actually quite aware that there could be a drilling thing, so they were always online listening for this, but they had no idea, all right, how deep this was or just how many explosives this was. All right, so they pack this with explosives, they get ready, and this is where Grant really makes a mistake, all right, in that he doesn't take command of this, okay, and he's expecting Meade to take command of this, but Meade himself is very leery about this plan. He doesn't really, he's kind of tepid about it, right? And so he goes, okay, you guys want to go ahead and do this. They were part of Burnside, if I'm not mistaken, part of Burnside's corps that did this. He says, go ahead and plan it, and let's see what you guys can come up with, right? And even when they came up and they said they're ready to go, Meade was still kind of tepid with it, right? Which wouldn't have been a bad thing, except for the fact that the commanders then, some of them were all for it and some of them weren't, right? And unfortunately,
well, there's a good reason reason. There's a good reason, MC, and we'll get to that here in a second. I'll let you continue, but there's a reason he didn't really like this plan, and we're gonna see why.
Well, it's not the reason you think it is, though, because he didn't plan this correctly. Because he left it up to the other people to command it, and then come back with a solution to how they're going to do this. They made an absolute hash of this. Now, in there was a group of black troops, right? That a major group of them, and they were the ones that they were told that they were going to be going in there first, but that when they got there, there was also a group coming with them, all right, that were coming with ladders, right? Now, they go out there, the explosion happens, and it is absolutely massive. It's so big an explosion, it actually breaks windows all the way into Richmond. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and it blows a gigantic hole in Lee's line. I mean, it does succeed at that.
Yeah,
and it stuns everybody for a good 3-4 minutes,
yeah,
right?
At least. All right, everyone's just looking at this going, wow. All right, the black troops funnel in, right down into the crater and have no way to get out.
Yeah, and then the Confederates come to their senses, and they line up around the top of the crater, and it's a fucking, shooting fish in a barrel. Well, literally.
They're not even. They're shooting them. They're massacring the troops that flooded into the crater. The guys that were supposed to be at the ladder actually were in the back instead of in the front. All right, so they never even make it to the crater. Okay, to be able to mount the assault. The assault was supposed to be with a coordination of troops along the entire general line to prevent exactly what happened, which was a massive reinforcement in that one area, all right, which does happen. The Georgia troops not only are throwing, shooting down, just laying down and shooting at them because these people can't get away, they're rolling in grenades. They're just rolling grenades down the bottom into the crater. I mean, just major loss of life. All right, it does buckle the line and put the big hole in the line right there, but they just build trenches around it, and that's the end of it, right? So it overall it doesn't work any better than it was before. And of course, Grant is very upset with this absolute disaster.
The same thing happened in World War I, but the British try it
in a certain sense, yeah.
It failed then too, correct?
Well, but it failed then for a different reason. And the reason it failed then was because the Germans had already perfected, defense in depth. Yeah, we'll talk about that when we talk about the World War I. But this would have been a major success if they could have gotten the troops in and out of the crater. If they'd have done it right, they would have been behind the lines. They would have been rolling up the flanks of those lines, and everything would have Lee's lines would have collapsed. Okay, it would have.
Could you imagine being Lee at that moment, though? You're like, I don't know, when did they do this explosion? Was it in the morning? Is he sitting down for breakfast? No,
I suspect that he was asleep at night. I expect he was asleep when this rattled it.
That's one hell of a way to wake up. Like, holy shit. What the fuck was that?
Yeah, that's exactly what everyone would be saying. What the hell was that? And it's a massive mine. I mean, it's a massive explosion. And it turns in, like I said, turns into a major disaster. So, and it's unfortunate that it did so from the Union perspective. So now they have to lay in a siege warfare. And what's the advantage? Well, what happens now is Grant is getting resupplied with men, and he's getting resupplied with brand new weaponry, including those big friggin' mortars that you see, right, in all the pictures. Let me see if I can pull one up here real quick. Picture Grant. See if I can find one. Where is it? Where is it?
Well, no, and that was one of the largest explosions on the North American continent for a long time until I believe the atomic tests, right?
Well, actually, there was in World War II there was a major explosion in Galveston of AMPHO. It was actually pretty devastating. It was close to an atomic bomb level. Took out most of Galveston in the harbor. Let me see if I
But
can bring this up. Let me
but
pull
no, and they end up going into siege mode for at least 6 months, I believe a year, but I don't want to overstate
it's
it.
good. It's close to a year because it goes all the way into April. I'm trying to get a picture of one of these blown up. There we go. And let me share this now. It shows you this. I just wanted people to get an understanding of the size of this freaking thing, because these things are massive. All right, there we go. You can see just how large the man standing next to it is. Okay, and how big this mortar actually is. Look at the size of this thing. All right, you can see the size of the projectiles that they're firing, and Grant is able to have these mortars, all right, brought in one after another, and as they come in, he puts them on the line, and they begin shelling. All right, they begin shelling the lines, and they keep lobbing these things in there. I mean, you can see this thing's the size of a man. These things weigh tons. This is all iron and steel.
That was a brand new innovation at the time.
The size of these things were, yes. All right, I mean, they're just absolutely massive. All right, and they're firing, and they're just pounding relentlessly. They're pounding, and of course, what happens is they pound for a while, then they stop, and then as Grant gets more troops, okay, he keeps extending the line. He keeps going south, extending his lines around Petersburg. All right, one shovelful at a time. The men are basically digging a trench work all the way around Petersburg. All right, and as he gets more troops, and this becomes the problem, Grant's getting more troops throughout this entire time. Right,
and Lee is stuck, unable to maneuver, unable to bring in fresh troops. He's got his hands tied.
Exactly. He's in a strong defensive position, but initially, as the lines get extended and further, he becomes weaker and weaker. The line as a whole becomes weaker and weaker because they just don't have the troops coming up. In addition to that, of course, it's a siege. The amount of food stuff coming in is limited. People, the troops are getting fed, but it's very irregular. They're losing weight throughout this entire siege. Now, what happens is after they fire back and forth at one another, and of course, what the Union, because salvos are obviously far heavier and from a longer distance, but for the most part, it's not breaking the lines. It's not doing anything from a breaking the lines or anything. But after they fire at one another, they both sides, their troops will come out, and then they pick up a card game. They'll trade coffee. They'll trade newspapers. Newspapers were a big thing that they traded. All right, as to what each others were saying about one another. And this was actually a source of intelligence. All right, so the intelligence people had no intention of stopping these little visits. All right, because you could get intel from this. Right, so they would let them fraternize, and then what would happen is they'd say, okay, we're going to bombard it, like say 10 o'clock at night, right? So they tell the other side, okay, the bombardment's going to stop at 10 o'clock at night. Go in there and hide until after 10, and it'll be going on, and then after it stops, we'll come back and see you. And that's what this turned into. Now, it starts in June, like we said, all right, carries on through July, where they attempt to do one more attempt at forcing the lines, which doesn't work. And then they settle in for a constant siege warfare at this point. All right. So they're digging, all right, all through August, all through September, all through October, November, December.
Why hasn't Davis left? Most of the cabinet has left Richmond at this point. The vice president, Stevens, fled a long time before this, I believe. Jefferson Davis doesn't. He stays put. Why?
Well, why wouldn't you? I mean, you've got to sit up there and keep up the big, the face that we can still win this. We can still win. We can still win. Well, all right. So through 64, all the way in, you have the election, and in December of 64, now that Lincoln is been reelected. You're not going to. That's not going to happen. All right. So at that point, it's just bravado. All right, on the part of Davis. At that point, he's hoping for a miracle. All right, that somehow they can be saved in some miraculous, in some miraculous turn. That somewhere along the lines there's going to be this miraculous turn, and it's just not going to happen. All right.
Yeah, well, no, and Davis, like we're going to talk about here at the end, his flight out of Richmond. If he would have done that a lot sooner, he could have made it to Montgomery at least. And I mean wherever else he was trying to go.
Right, but at that point you abandon Virginia. Once you abandon Virginia, you are out of supplies. Understand this. Any chance that you have of winning the war now is basically, from a force of arms perspective, is completely gone. You'll never have the force of arms necessary to actually take on any of the major units. What they have is what they have. They'll be getting no further reinforcements, no further ammo, no heavy weapons.
Well, okay. Then let's progress here. You're into 65 now. Lee decides his position is untainable.
Well, what happens is the lines finally get extended to basically the last rail line, and now it's untenable. All right. If the rail line's cut, there's absolutely no chance that he has. He then sits up there and warns Davis. Davis is in a church, I believe, at prayers on Sunday, saying, "You have to leave. I can't hold Petersburg. All right. I'm evacuating. You need to evacuate Richmond."
Well, how do you think that conversation went? Because I haven't seen any writings, and I even looked through my university's database. I haven't seen any writings on this conversation between Lee and Davis. Davis must have been distraught.
Well, you're at church and you get a notice that you better evacuate now or else. How would you feel? And yes, I'm sure he was distraught. And they begin burning things and so forth and fleeing Richmond. As part of the fleeing Richmond, they blow up a supply train, which almost,
the supply train, I believe, was in Atlanta. I believe what happened here was the musicians factory.
Ammo dump. Could be, yeah. Either way, it's massive and huge, causes a fire. Unlike Atlanta, however, there isn't any when the troops go march into Richmond. There's not a burning, mainly because it's more of a somber kind of an environment, and Lee begins his retreat. Now, even while Lee is retreating and Grant is chasing Lee, all right, Lincoln moves to go to Richmond,
which was kind of foolish, right?
Yeah, and possibly in a way. So he visits, I think it's April 5th, I believe. He visits Richmond. And he sees firsthand, of course, the devastation and everything. And it's interesting how the people of Richmond greet him because they don't know what to expect. Now, Lincoln orders he has protection, and he orders his unit for protection. His, basically the Praetorian Guard, if you want to look at it from that perspective, right? The guys that are there to guard the president. He chooses a black unit, an all-black unit, all right, as his force to keep him safe, all right?
Yeah, well, okay, that's all fine and well, but we skipped over something here. In the defenses of Richmond, there were black Confederate troops. You realize that, right? Davis, months before, had put in an executive order authorizing the use of black forces with the caveat that if they serve the Confederate Army, they will hereby be freed.
Right.
He did that. That did happen.
Yes,
Let's not gloss over that.
It did happen, but at that point in time, how many states were effectively in the Confederacy?
North Carolina, South Carolina hadn't fallen yet.
Pretty much South Carolina was well on its way to going the way of the dodo. Yeah.
Texas never surrenders, I don't believe, really. You had the Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma, the northern half of Louisiana.
No, you didn't have the northern half of Louisiana anymore. It's already gone. Louisiana's gone. Mississippi is basically there's pockets in Mississippi, all right, half of Alabama, all right. Georgia is already completely gone, all right. Tennessee is completely gone. So there's not much of a Confederacy left. Florida is already gone.
Well, Florida falls early in the war. They swoop up through the Keys and capture the main areas in southern Florida right at the very outset.
For the most part, yeah. I mean, but there was coastal area for the most part. But Florida is completely cut off now. I mean, there's nothing left for Florida.
Well, same with Texas. Texas is cut off, but it is still a Confederate state. If Davis could somehow make it to Texas, he could have been all right for a while. But
what do you mean all right for a while? He has no weapons.
Petticoat, dude. All right, we haven't gotten to that part yet.
He has no weapons. The troops have no weapons, and the troops at this point are basically on starvation rations. And one of the problems that happens during this retreat.
Forget that Davis had the Confederate treasury with him.
Okay, what was left of the Confederate treasury? Almost nothing.
Well, there was a shit ton left, dude. There was a lot of gold on that train.
If there was a lot of gold on that train, then explain to me why they weren't spending it earlier in the war.
Where are they going to buy stuff from? You had a freaking blockade, well, then
man. What goods to have all the gold then?
All right. Okay. We'll start arguing here when we go into the what ifs. So Davis finds out at a church ceremony that he needs to evacuate. He then starts to immediately burn a lot of the Confederate papers, have the treasury loaded onto a train, and start his evacuation, right?
Yep. And in the meantime, Grant is chasing Lee. And let's pull up the
What do you think that Jefferson Davis burned? Do you think it was the order to kill Abraham Lincoln? I've heard that rumor.
Nah, I think that's nonsense. I think that they're just generic things that you burn during wartime, what the dispositions are, what your conversations have been with leaders and so forth like that. I mean, that's just general military type of burning things that happen.
There is no Confederate order to kill the president, you don't think? You don't think that came from the Confederate Secret Service?
No, I don't.
Neither do I. I just wanted to hear your position on it. So go ahead and go back to Grant and Lee. That's right. We'll get to the political implications here in a few.
So this becomes Lee's retreat, all right? And you can see that as he's retreating, Grant is staying immediately on his heels. He's giving Lee no respite, all right? No chance to stop the retreat. He keeps pushing him the entire way. And one of the things that happens here at this high bridge in the Sawyer's Creek is part of Lee's army is actually cut off. All right.
Yes. I have some quotes I want to read. Actually, let me get to this. It's opening up right now. This is okay. So. All right. The march from Richmond and Petersburg started well enough. Many of the Confederates, including Lee, seemed exhilarated at being in the field once again. But after the first day's march, signs of weariness and hunger began to appear. When Lee reached Amelia Courthouse on April 4th, he found to his dismay that the rations for his men had not arrived. Although a rapid march was crucial, the hungry men in the Army of Northern Virginia needed supplies. While awaiting the arrival of troops from Richmond, delayed by flood conditions, Lee decided to halt the march and send wagons into the countryside to gather provisions. Local farmers had little to give, and the wagons returned practically empty. All right, so he has to delay, and he has to search for food. He has Grant right on his heels.
Yep.
This is a delay that Lee could not afford.
Correct.
And here's what I was actually looking for. As the retreating columns became more ragged, gaps developed in the line of march. At Sailor's Creek, a few miles east of Farmville, Union cavalry exploited such a gap to block two Confederate corps under Lieutenant General Richard Anderson and Ewell until the much larger Sixth Corps arrived to crush them. Watching the debacle from a nearby hill, Lee exclaimed, "My God, has the army been dissolved?"
Yeah.
This is Lee knows it's over. I mean, if he actually has that even in his head, he thought his troops were invincible a year and a half before this.
Yep. Almost 2 years ago, they were masters of the domain. Now they're little more than a ragtag group of people. Siege warfare will do that to you, for one thing. Siege warfare is very hard on troops. Actually, siege warfare is hard on both sides in that regard, because it changes the mentality of the troops from marching all the time into a static kind of war where the idea of death is always omnipresent for every hour of every day. As sharpshooters, will pick off a guy here or pick off a guy there, right, on both sides. So it wears you into a numbing kind of just acceptance of things, okay? And you're no longer that swinging group of hellraisers that you were before, right? Ready to charge into anything, because you haven't done a charge in how long? I mean, and what's more is it's like, okay, it's very fatalistic, all right? You've got to get your whole unit out of that mindset, and it's not easy necessarily to do. And on the retreating force, of course, it's even worse, because they know they're retreating.
Yeah, and I could just imagine Lee on top of that hill actually contemplating, has my army been dissolved? Is this the end? And then he follows it up with, it goes into another paragraph and it says, not yet. I'm guessing that's when Grant sent his first envoy over, right?
Well, at this point in time, what's happening is Lee's own commanders are basically starting to go, look, it's over. And they're pressing on him, saying, "Look, we need to think about surrender. We need to think about the unthinkable, because we're not going to have a choice." Another thing that happens during this debacle here at Sawyer's Creek is some of the wagons get overturned, and one of the wagons that was listed for actual Longstreet, all right, overturns, and it has, along with some of his personal effects, several things of food, all right, which the starving men are like, okay, well, wait a minute here. Are the generals just feeding themselves and letting us die? Now, there's no indication that that's what was going on, that the Southern generals were hoarding food for themselves, especially Longstreet, who basically would never have done something like that. That's just not part of his character. But
I would think they might have gotten some extra food rations and they were going to ration them out.
I'm sure that they would have. But the thing is that's not the impression that these hungry men would get at that point in time, which then further damages morale. Even if they don't believe it necessarily, it's going to be there in the back of their minds. All right. Have we been let down? Okay. And so desertion during this entire flight, desertion is incredible. All right. The army is deserting in droves. They're every day when they sit up there and do a muster and they count the number of troops, they're losing 10% a day.
Well, and a lot of that would be just exhaustion and men just stopping, right? I mean,
they're at their wits' ends. They can't go any further. It's rather to be captured, or they just say, you know what? I'm from Georgia. To hell with this shit. And they just start walking home.
Yeah, especially after they hear about the devastation in South Carolina and Georgia. A lot of those troops were South Carolina troops. And I'm sure they had heard at this point about what Sherman was doing in South Carolina.
Oh, I'm sure that they were aware of it. Like I said, they were trading papers, right? They knew generally what was going on. In many ways, this battle. There's very few surprises that happen. There's tactical surprise, but there's never any strategic surprises in any of the battles that happen. There's never a strategic surprise.
So, Lee's he gets delayed again at the battle at Sailor's Creek and High Bridge. He then retreats past Farmville. Why does he end up going to Appomattox? It's just the next stop along the road.
Well, he's doing whatever he can to get to Lynchburg, and at Appomattox, unfortunately, the Union forces have gotten there ahead of him. He can't get around them now. There's no way to flank, to get around. He is now basically completely out of options to try and get around Grant.
He could have fought.
And he would have been completely destroyed. Okay, great. For what reason?
There's something to be said for a glorious defeat.
That's all well and good to sit up there and say from 100 years in the future, and with lots of perspective. And you weren't one of those troops, and you were not one of those commanders who had to feed them into that kind of a meat grinder.
Hey, I have relatives that were one of those troops, and they survived.
So
maybe they would have died.
So what you're saying is that I would have to deal with you if they would have if that slaughter would have taken place.
Yeah, I might not be around if Lee would have had his glorious defeat. Yeah.
Do you think that would be a good option or not? I don't think it served.
I kind of like being alive.
I don't think it serves any purpose, and at that point in time, American commanders tend to be very pragmatic in that regard. When there's no chance, now let me tell you, the military has some really, really harsh rules about certain things. But when you retreat and you give up your command, you have to understand that there's what will not giving up do. Is it going to materially affect the enemy? No. If you fight that battle, it wasn't just a battle to win. It was, can you do enough damage to the enemy to help your cause in this case? Was their cause going to be any further helped along with the total destruction of their men to the last man?
Was Lee going the way he was going to give Davis some breathing room to retreat via rail? Because why didn't Lee just go with Davis?
And with what? You can't load up troops like that. You don't have that. You remember, I mean, there's one thing to sit up there and get on one train, but when you got 30,000 troops, loading up 30,000 troops, how many rail cars is that?
Stack them on the roof for all I give a fuck. Like, we got to go.
You got to have enough troops to do it. You got to have enough ability to do it. And then where were you going? You could go south. Okay, into what? Were you going to get supplies? Are your men going to get fed? All right. Even the rail back then was 20 miles an hour. So you dump them off in the middle of North Carolina with no food, no supplies, no nothing. What's going to happen to them?
They wouldn't have been captured at Appomattox.
Well, okay, great. That's hindsight, isn't it?
Yeah, and how does Grant, with his larger force, get ahead of Lee? Is his army really this bad right now?
His army is able to stop and rest. All right, his army can move faster simply because they're not retreating. All right, they're just trying to get ahead. It's a sprint.
The rule is usually this: the smaller force is more maneuverable and quicker. Not in this case.
Well, in this case, it's a matter of that's all well and good as long as your vanguard is not in contact with the enemy. He has enough troops to where he can keep a section of that always pressing them, while other troops that aren't engaged in that swing wide and rapidly in rapid movement. They've got to maintain kind of like a constant barrage back and forth. Stop. Go online, then retreat and pull back. Go back online, pull back, because the vanguard can't just collapse or it becomes a complete rout.
All right, so day one at Appomattox, Lee says, no, I will not surrender to these terms, right?
Yeah. He says not yet until he takes a look at the entire situation and then goes, okay. And as a matter of fact, in his last, as he's getting ready to meet Grant for the last time, he views one of his subordinates, Mr. General Pickett, and says to someone who's reportedly said, "I thought that man had been relieved."
Oh, no shit. I didn't hear that one.
Yes, he had days before during the movement from Petersburg, he was very, very upset with the inaction of Pickett, and he sent orders to have Pickett relieved of command. Now, there is a major debate whether or not Pickett received those orders and just ignored it, or whether or not those orders never got to him in time.
If those orders never got to him, could you imagine being him and having Robert E. Lee fucking just look at you with disdain? I thought I had that man relieved.
Well, what's worse is okay. I mean, the animosity that Pickett bore towards Robert E. Lee to this day. I mean, till the day he died, he bemoaned the fact that man got all my men killed. So, I mean, the situation is what it is.
Let's set the stage here. Here's Robert E. Lee.
Yep.
Immaculate. General's uniform, Southern gentleman, sword on his hip, shows up early. Grant comes in a private's uniform.
He doesn't come in a private's uniform.
He did.
In his normal uniform.
Freaking borrowed private's uniform with a general stripe on it. Yeah, that's what they say. Yeah, I read that.
There was not a private uniform. He may have looked like a private, which is what they said. He was, because he was dusty and he looked like he was just one of his people, but it was not a private's uniform. And what's more is the place that this is taking place is owned by the man who had left his house. All right, because it had been used and been on the front row seat of Manassas.
Yeah, true. It ends almost where it began. First Bull Run.
Well, no, it doesn't end at Bull Run, but it ends in this guy's house. This guy had moved to Appomattox to avoid the fighting, and then all of a sudden he's back at the same thing again.
But I have okay. Well, first off, let's do it in order. Lee and Grant meet. What is said?
There's no recording of this. Now, this is one of the things that I find quite interesting is there's no actual recording. What we hear from people is basically what he said, where he says, "We've met before." Grant says, and Lee goes, "I don't, in Mexico," and he goes, "I don't recall," right? Which is very possible, right? That the two had met before, and Lee then goes, "Okay, what are your terms?" And after a couple attempts at pleasantries, and he says, "Okay, you can keep your men can keep their troops and go home. They just gotta swear. All right, the officers basically will probably have to hold the officers, but your men can go home. Right? If they have horses that are theirs, they can take their horses and they can take their weapons, their private weapons.
They let them keep their sidearms as well, or at least he lets Lee keep his sidearm. Correct?
Yes. He doesn't take the sword from Lee. He says you can keep it, and doesn't take his sword, which is normally that's one of the things of surrender is you turn over your sword. I mean, it's a ceremonial thing, but Lee does, or Grant doesn't keep his sword.
Can you imagine if Grant would have took it and hung it on his wall or something? I mean, if I was Grant, I probably would have. That's Robert E. Lee's fucking sword.
Well, you're not talking about people who have fought a freaking nasty ass battle for 4 freaking years and seen death and carnage, and you got to remember Lee and Grant both, they didn't hate one another. Okay. They had no animosity. This is not, you don't see Grant cheering, right? Ha ha, I got you, you stupid old wily fox. Now that'll be the end of you dirty rebels. That isn't what it is. It's an acknowledgement of, okay, we now begin the next job, which is, okay, we got to put all this behind us. And they both knew that this is going to be, for some, absolutely impossible to do. But they had to, for the most part, they both had to make it work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll grant you, I'll grant you this when it comes to Grant. I don't see the venom and animosity in his words, as they're quoted or as he wrote down, like I do Sherman's. There was a real venom in Sherman's words, I feel like, compared to Grant.
Oh, sure. To a large extent, Sherman is a much different individual, all right, than Grant is. Grant, for the most part, is he's a quiet, unassuming kind of an individual. He's generally what they would call an introvert. He's not an extrovert. Sherman is exactly the opposite. In fact, at one point, Sherman, when he's talking about Grant, says, I'm a damn sight smarter than Grant. All right. He goes, but where Grant beats me and beats everybody around is Grant goes on with what he thinks is best and doesn't worry about things that he can't change, or that he'll deal with it as it comes with complete aplomb. He doesn't worry about what else is going on the outside. He doesn't worry about the what ifs. Okay.
So unconditional surrender Grant gives a conditional surrender to Lee. Why? Because he can't haul these men back?
No, I think it's because he knows that there's no reason to. This is the end of the war. I think that everyone understands that the war ends when Lee surrenders. Everybody for all intents and purposes. Will there be sparks here and there? Yes, but for the most part, everyone understands when Lee surrenders, it's over. The war is now over.
All right, so their meeting comes to an end. Lee doesn't, at least they don't say that he says anything at this moment, but they say he steps out the door and he shoves his closed fist into the palm of his hand, looks off, and then he goes to give this speech. And it's really short and sweet.
Well, he goes to leave, and as he's leaving, the Army of the Potomac salutes him along the entire way.
I forgot about that. Good job. Yeah. I forgot about that because that's actually kind of interesting, in itself, right?
Well, it's honoring a defeated enemy, and an enemy that's been an implacable foe, but now someone who is and will be once again an American, just like they were.
So Lee issues General Order Number 9. After 4 years of arduous service marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources. I need not tell the brave survivors of so many hard-fought battles who have remained steadfast to the last that I have consented to this result from no distrust of them, but feeling that valor and devotion could accomplish nothing that would compensate for the loss that would have attended the continuance of the contest. I determined to avoid the useless sacrifice of those whose past services have endeared them to their countrymen. By the terms of the agreement, officers and men can return to their homes and remain there until exchanged. You will take with you this satisfaction that proceeds from the consciousness of duty faithfully performed. And I earnestly pray that a merciful God will extend to you his blessing and protection. With an unceasing admiration of your consistency and devotion to your country, and a grateful remembrance of your kind and generous consideration for myself, I bid you all an affectionate farewell. Real short speech that he gave his men. Okay, there is something important in there, though. You may remain at your homes until exchanged. At this moment, Davis is still on the run, and there's still an army in the West, right?
Technically, yes, but after Lee surrenders, the army in the army in the West immediately surrenders as well. Johnston surrenders.
Jefferson Davis sure as fuck don't. This is when This is when we
Jefferson Davis is trying to set up a government in exile, which is what his dream was: run to Mexico, set up a government in exile, and then supposedly stay there. It was ridiculous. All right, the war was over. He's on the run. Everyone's looking for him, and basically, no matter where he goes at this point in time, there's Union forces all around. And he's able to bypass several of them, all right, in his attempt to flee. But eventually, of course, he's discovered because they basically out him. You got people that are Union sympathizers, and they say, "There he is, and we found him. Here he is."
He starts to run. His wife throws her shawl over him. She does this. He doesn't try and dress up like a girl to avoid capture. That is a rumor propagated by the North for years.
Was he wearing a shawl over the top of his head to hide himself?
She threw it on him.
I don't care who threw it on him. Was he doing it? Yes or no? Yes.
He wasn't a fucking cross-dresser. No, MC. Fuck you.
I never said. Well, I didn't say this time he was a cross-dresser. I said it to you for just to annoy you. But no, he was hiding himself and trying to pass himself off as a woman, thinking he could get past. That's reality.
He is arrested. All right. Let's get to it. Here we go. Abraham Lincoln, Ford's Theater. Go ahead, MC.
Abraham Lincoln, the war is over. He's been to Richmond. All right. He then is in what they call an ebullient mood. He's actually in a good mood for once. I mean, the war is coming to an end. He is making plans. He's getting ready for the next fight, which are political fights that he's going to relish. He's expecting to relish these fights to cause the Reconstruction, right? That to prevent Reconstruction from going the way it does, because he wants the South now to come back and be part of the Union. All right, which was never in his mind ever broken. So he's at this point in time, he's ready to welcome them completely back in. He goes to the theater. Several people are expected to be with him that defer, actually. His normal bodyguards and so forth were not there. He is sitting in a box with his wife watching a theater production that was a comedy of sorts, all right, which the people said at the time he was thoroughly enjoying. When John Wilkes Booth comes up behind him, shoots him in the head, all right, with a Derringer, a 44 Derringer, jumps off the balcony and flees. Lincoln is.
Hey, don't leave out the important part.
What important part?
Sit semper tyrannis.
That's. There's no actual proof that he said it. There's other people who said it. They didn't hear anything. So that's another one of the freaking myths promulgated by the South and their freaking lost cause bullshit.
And he breaks his leg upon the balcony.
He does injure his leg. All right, and then he escapes. Lincoln is carried, and this is part of a wider assassination.
As he's escaping, there's two other parts of the plot that are supposed to be going on simultaneously. We got to tell the whole story, MC.
And this is part of a plot that for all intents and purposes, John Wilkes Booth and his co-conspirators came up with by themselves. All right. They're supposed to get Secretary Seward, I believe, and Secretary Stanton. All right.
And Stanton gets assaulted, right? Or is it Stewart that gets assaulted?
I think it's Stanton that does get assaulted with a knife attack. But he doesn't die. And I think
the guy thought he killed him, though. The guy thought he killed him. But why? He snuck into his bedroom and did this. Why are you stabbing him like this is a fucking slasher flick? Why don't you walk up, slit his throat, and leave? Like, what's wrong with you? Are you
Well,
fucking?
yeah, who knows what happened at that point? Nobody sits up and says whether or not he woke up when the guy came at him. That's probably one of the things that happened. All right, so it says that he did wake up before the guy actually stabbed him. He didn't wake up from the stabbing.
Oh, okay, all right, fair enough. Okay.
So I assume that he was tussling for at that point. All right, the other guy chickened out and basically fled.
He got drunk, right? He just got wasted and fucking took off.
Yeah, because he didn't want to. He didn't want to do it. Okay. Lincoln is mortally wounded. He's not
the rope anyway, though. Fucker should have at least had the balls to do it. You're gonna get the rope either way, you dumb bastard.
Well, once again, hindsight's 2020. He goes on the run. Lincoln is carried back. He doesn't die for a few hours. All right, but they know that it's only a matter of time. His wife is basically, Mary Todd Lincoln is just inconsolable, crying and so forth, right? And Lincoln dies. At that point,
when it's for a couple days, right? It's a rather slow death, I thought.
No, he died. It's hours later. It's not 2 days.
Hours. Okay.
Unfortunately, there's a lot of people who believe, all right, because of the wound, that the doctor probing for the bullet actually pushed it further into his brain and that's what killed him, right?
What's interesting?
Modern technology, obviously, is
he might have survived. Yeah.
Well, but would he have been able to survive? We don't know. All right, nobody knows whether or not he could have survived a wound like that. Gunshot wounds are notorious, and the caliber being a .44, that's a pretty big round. Okay.
Here's a question. Do you okay, so I've heard stories where Abraham Lincoln supposedly had a dream weeks before his assassination of him walking into the parlor of the White House or whatever, and his wife's crying, and then he's like, what happened? And they're like, the president is dead, and he walks up and there's himself in the coffin. Do you think that's true? Because if it is, that is crazy.
There are stories about him that he didn't think that he would live out his term in office. He did have a premonition that people had talked about, apparently, that he was never going to return home to Illinois. Okay, that was the last time that he would ever be in Illinois, and basically it was. So it's impossible to know. I mean, after something like this, it all turns into conspiracy theories about anything and everything that goes on. John Wilkes Booth is basically becomes target number one. Now, while that's all going on, one of the things.
Well, real quick, the plot. Okay, so. One secretary is assaulted. They catch him almost immediately. John Wilkes Booth is actually let out of D.C. by somebody, right? And that person ends up in the trial. Like I said, let's go through this step by step here, because
go ahead and we'll talk about each step that you want to talk about, since you want to do it this way.
Well, right. Who lets him out of D.C.? Somebody lets him out, and they end up in trouble as well. I can't remember the guy's name, because they order D.C. shut down, right?
Well, of course they do. They immediately order D.C. to be shut down, but I believe that John Wilkes Booth gets to that part of it before the order to shut down is actually gets there. He actually beats that order out of D.C.
Is his companion that supposedly is in the shed with him? Is he with him at this point already?
No, they meet up after they're in Virginia, if I'm not mistaken, at the place where he goes to where the doctor helps his foot. I think that's
Dr. Mudd.
Yeah.
Do you believe Mudd even knew about the assassination? I don't.
Well, I think he knew about the assassination. Everybody knew about it.
That quickly? They didn't have telephones, MC.
They had telegraphs, and news like the president being shot and killed by assassination would definitely fly through the telegraphs. Everybody knew about it before almost immediately. It was in the newspapers the next day. Everybody knew.
So he was a part of it then, you think?
Do I think he was a part of it? No. I think that he was a doctor. He saw a man injured. He knew who he was, but he decided, okay, well, it's an injured man. I'll just look at it as if it's an injured man. All right, Hippocratic oath and everything.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
You don't think it was because he was a Southern sympathizer in any way?
He may have had a few Southern sympathies, but I don't think the thing about the assassination of Lincoln is it does not create this mass euphoria in the South. The South does not celebrate Lincoln's assassination. There aren't parades. There aren't people going huzzah. All right. People are in shock.
And they're terrified. They just lost the war, and now somebody just killed the president in their name. They're going to get the retribution. They saw what happened in South Carolina.
And what's more is the blacks who hear about this, they come weeping in mass around the White House, wondering whether or not this means they're going to be forced back into slavery again, because the great emancipator has been killed. So it really creates a very unsettling time. Okay, for what this is. That's not to say that there weren't individuals who were happy that Lincoln wasn't assassinated, right? But overall, that was not the general tenor, right, of the South.
All right. So, do you believe John Wilkes Booth dyed his hair when he was at Dr. Mudd's house? Because the man that got shot and killed at the barn had red hair. And every picture I've ever seen of John Wilkes Booth, he has jet black hair. So.
All right. Well, that's what that once again, that's conspiracy theory garbage of people that were making claims of what they said. This person said that this person said that this person said. All right. We don't know. We weren't there. We do know this, that John Wilkes Booth died. We do know that they have his DNA.
Did they match that DNA up to his brother?
I believe they did. Now, at the time they didn't, but that's been matched since then, yes. Obviously, DNA.
We do know who his direct relatives were. We do know he had a brother who was also an actor. There was his father as well, I believe. They know where he's buried. So, yeah.
So, for the most part, a lot of this becomes speculation. I mean, did he really die? Did he really get killed? People were saying they saw, it's like the sightings of Elvis. Have you seen Elvis? There are people that swear today that Elvis is still alive. All right. It's that kind of stuff. None of it's confirmed. There's obviously no way of confirming any of this. It seems to be that it would be very unlikely, however.
All right, so now Abraham Lincoln's dead. Jefferson Davis is in a Yankee prison. They decide not to try him for treason. I contend the reason they didn't try him for treason is because he would have been tried in Virginia. And it would have been an argument over secession and its legality.
He never would have been tried in Virginia. He would have been tried in a military court, and he would have been found guilty.
And why didn't they do it? And why did a New Yorker?
Because at that point in time, what's it serve? Okay, you're trying to put the nation back together, and if you're going to do that with Jefferson Davis, then you're going to have to do it to the leading Confederate generals, especially Robert E. Lee. And nobody wanted to see Robert E. Lee on trial because they considered him an honorable man. It's not because they were afraid of the South or anything else. It was because they considered him an honorable man, and it was time to put it behind them. And specifically, the man in charge of this, of course, the president of the United States, is Andrew Johnson. Johnson comes from Tennessee. All right, he comes from the South. All right, he wants to put the South back together again as if it never left the Union. In this regard, he was very similar, all right, to Abraham Lincoln. What he wasn't, however, was he wasn't Abraham Lincoln. He didn't have the ability to talk to people and get them to see it his way. All right. And what's bad about that is the people who want to take revenge for what the South did, all right, gain ascendance, the radical Republicans, and they want to punish the South. And they begin to pass legislation with that very thought in mind.
Okay, so Abraham Lincoln's theory was the South never left, therefore they would never have to rejoin in Union. They were never authorized to leave.
That's correct.
We're not going to go too deep into Reconstruction because we are going to do a series on that one day. It'll be, later. But how do you think Abraham Lincoln would have handled Reconstruction?
He would have welcomed the South back in. He probably would have attempted to immediately. One of the things that wouldn't have happened, in my opinion, is Robert E. Lee. All the officers, all the commissioned officers of the South, have to repetition the government to be considered American citizens again. All right. I don't think that law ever would have gotten passed. Number one, but even if it had been passed, Lincoln would have made sure that it was like carte blanche. It was just like a formality. And certain people like Robert E. Lee, who did petition the government to become a U.S. citizen again, to be allowed to be a U.S. citizen again, that he would have guaranteed that would have happened. All right. Lee would have been allowed to be a U.S. citizen once more. There would have been military districts to some degree set up. All right. However, the rules, I don't think that the first rule where they tossed out all the legislature of the southern states prior to Reconstruction would have taken place. They would have said, it's how they voted. You're going to have to deal with the fact that this is how they voted. All right. By doing that, all right, what would have happened is the South probably would have been much less likely to pass the draconian laws, all right, that turn into what they call the Jim Crow laws and so forth, all right away. Things would have been delayed. Things would have been ameliorated probably pretty quickly. There would have been a movement probably encouraged by Lincoln, all right, to go back to Africa, all right, depending upon how that took place. There would have been other bills that would have been immediately passed, such as, okay, now that we've freed the slaves, we have to create an education program so that they can pull them up by the bootstraps and see how that goes. All right. Lincoln had a decent rapport with Frederick Douglass, and I think that would have continued. Okay, so some of the ideas of Frederick Douglass would have gotten brought in. Okay, I don't think that the problems with slavery and the aftermath of slavery were going to be things that were going to be instantly healed, but a path forward would have been forged that doesn't get forged until the 1940s, where that begins again. It's really the 1940s. It isn't until World War II, all right, where African Americans once again there's a really strong push in the public eye overall to bring African Americans and say, look, they're full citizens. We got to stop the nonsense and treat them as citizens. I think that would have happened much sooner.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. Cabby, you able to talk? I saw that you jumped in and out. Oh, okay. Well, you tried to jump back in. Can you talk now? Take that as a no.
Hello, Cabbage.
Hello.
There we are.
Yeah, let's hang out. Yeah, it's freaking out.
But no, I tend to agree with you actually, MC. I think a lot of the bad race relations in the South really stemmed from the way Reconstruction was handled. And when we actually talk about Reconstruction, we'll go into that because I think it was fumbled majorly.
Well, there was you can say it was fumbled, but you got to remember once Lincoln was assassinated, all right, first of all, that created a dynamic of vengeance that wasn't going to be stopped. This was the first time a sitting U.S. president had been assassinated. It had never happened before. Okay, it's not the first time that a U.S. president had died in office, but it was the first time one had ever been assassinated. Now, there had been assassination attempts, most notably the attempts on Andrew Jackson. Okay, but that hadn't happened before, and the weight of that on the nation was significant. There was, at that point in time, for the legislature, the Republicans in the legislature, the radical Republicans, the gloves came off. They were like, okay, you need to be punished for what you just did. The war was already over. You had lost. There was no need for this. Lee had surrendered.
So, okay, so MC, you're saying it was like retribution?
The Reconstruction?
Well,
You damn right.
It sounds like, yeah.
Yeah, it was retribution. The radical Republicans at that point. Their whole thing was they wanted to punish the South. The South needed to be punished for their transgressions. They were already set about it, and their forces, all right, their hold on the legislature grew massively because of the assassination of President Lincoln. Because it was like, okay, you can't trust any of the Southerners. It's not just the Southern forces that they were fighting now. They're looking at a Southern civilian that took it upon himself to assassinate the President of the United States.
30 grams of lead can achieve an awful lot.
But that's what happened.
And what's with the impeachment of Andrew is it Johnson or Jackson?
Yeah, Johnson. Okay. One of the people who was standing in the way of Reconstruction, of course, is the president. All right, Andrew Johnson. He's a Southerner. He doesn't like what the War Department is doing. All right, so he's constantly interfering, and it gets to the point where he says, you know what, the guy who is the Secretary of War needs to go. So he fires him. He orders him to be fired. The radical Republicans take it upon themselves to say, you can't fire a cabinet member. You have got to get, since the approval for him to be a cabinet member comes from the legislature, you can't just fire him on his own. Now you got to remember, you got to remember that they've Jackson, or Johnson rather, has been vetoing a number of bills, all right, that they're trying to send in front of him, all right, and they're forcing him he's forcing the legislature to override his vetoes, and not, of course, that not only delays things, but they're not able to always override his veto. Okay, so they were looking for, okay, we need an excuse. Well, since he fired this guy under illegal conditions in their minds, they said, okay, this is high crimes and misdemeanors. So the House impeaches him, and the Senate then tries him, saying that, well, the Senate is prerogative, all right, to basically say that the cabinet members don't serve at the behest of the president. All right, we approve the recommendation. Therefore, we have to approve anybody that you're saying has to go. All right, it goes to the Senate. The trial in the Senate goes in favor of Andrew Johnson. However, for all intents and purposes, after this fight, he is so politically damaged, all right, that he can't stop any of the Reconstruction articles as they go through. And the 13th amendment, which Lincoln had no problem with, the 13th Amendment goes through, but Lincoln didn't have a problem with that. But the problem was the 14th and 15th now get sent along.
Which one is it? Okay, the one that is horseshit is the one where it said, to rejoin the Union, you must ratify these amendments.
I think those things happen after Lincoln is assassinated.
Yeah, and that's ridiculous. Okay, that your whole basis for the war was saying we weren't allowed to leave the Union. Now you're telling us to rejoin the Union. We never left.
Once again, that was Lincoln's basis for the war. There were many people who believed that, but there were others that had a different view. Remember that. There were others that were fighting the war for their own reasons, that wanted the war fought for different reasons. Not everyone was believed or even following, the strictures of Abraham Lincoln.
Jensen in the chat says, "It's over now. MADD lied. The South lost." Well, they might have they lost the war, but they kind of win Reconstruction if you think about it, which is not necessarily good because the way they win is pretty shitty. But hey, it is what it is.
Reconstruction begins, but it's devastating. But at the same time, while representation, all right, gets changed, all right, and Black people are selected as representatives in several of the southern states, right? I think it's important to note that while that was going on, there were absolutely no African Americans or no Blacks that achieved that status anywhere north of the Mason-Dixon line.
Absolutely, and people forget about that. And no, the South devolves into utter chaos for what, 40 years, MC? I mean, it's just
40 years is now. It doesn't devolve into chaos for 40 years. All right, there is
quite
chaos.
a long time. 20 at least. A lot.
What was not a generation of chaos. All right, I mean, there is chaos initially.
Initially, dude, the stories out of New Orleans. Okay, you got the feuds that go on. You have people freaking burning Black churches and all the way up into
you do have, if you want to look at that as if it's one continuous event, then yeah, but it wasn't one continuous event. Were there flare-ups and stuff that were happening as a result of all this crap that go on? Yes. All right. Is the war forgotten? No. All right. But overall, the real chaos that goes on, right, only is fairly short. It lasts only a couple of years before things start to settle down.
You're talking about the initial Forest Rising, the initial Klan.
Well, I'm talking about the initial aspects of the chaos that people are living under. All right, where people don't know what's going to happen or how they're going to live. All right, people are human beings. They start buckling under, and there are hard times. All right, but the chaos of not knowing what's going to happen the next day. All right, that devolves. It resolves itself more or less fairly quickly because people got to get on with their lives, and
the flood to the west helps alleviate some of the pressure too. A lot of ex-Confederates head west.
Well, at this point in time, there's no reason to stay. All right, there is still, you can have land and opportunity in the west. That many of the people who were Union or Southern troops now, well, they've seen the breadth and width. They've been away from their families. They've been out there in the wide world. They're not afraid of the wide world. Okay, they're not bound to their homes and family anymore. In many cases, because home and family doesn't exist anymore. All right, in many cases. In other cases, it's like, well, what do we go back to? There's nothing that's going to change for me here. What is it that I have?
You know what an interesting way to look at it too, especially when you look at like the Wild West, and I'm putting my hands up in quotes there, but you can't see it. But like even in Tombstone, or it might have been Dodge City, one of them, the Cowboys, they were all ex-Confederates, and the Earps, Wyatt and them were all ex-Union. And that happened over and over again in what we call the Wild West, where the outlaw was an ex-Confederate or ex-Confederate militia, and the lawmen were usually ex-Union, right?
Well, I wouldn't. You had them forming groups, okay, and of course you're going to trust the people that you served with more than you're going to trust the people that you don't know. So naturally, in some of this lawless territories, you end up with these kind of things, and of course the animosity behind some of this doesn't just go away. Okay, so yeah, you can say that the Confederates, a lot of times where the Confederates were the outlaws. Well, to some extent that's true. You had some of the Union guys that turned outlaw as well. I mean, it wasn't as ubiquitous as you're making it sound, but it did it take place? Sure, of course. And of course you end up with the younger gang, and you end up with
hey, it's the James gang. Don't give Cole all the credit.
It's the younger gang. They were called the younger gang for how long? So you can laugh all you want. It was the younger gang for most of their outlaw days.
Well, I think a majority of them were the younger family, right? And then it was just the James brothers, Frank and Jesse. So
for the most part, yeah. So you end up with these kind of situations taking place. Now, did it create chaos and so forth? Well, yeah, it did, but not tremendously more. It was still more like a industrialization taking place. Railroads are getting built. You're not having constant warfare. Are you having feuds from clans? Yes, there's still clan feuds. In fact, the Hatfield and McCoys were a clan feud that goes back to the Civil War days. All right, that leads all the way into the beginnings of the 1900s.
Yep. Which is interesting because one of the McCoys was actually
come on, the Hatfields the Hatfields and the McCoys, their issues were not political; they were personal.
No, well, you can say that they're not political, but it still broke down along those lines. They were Southerners versus Northerners, and that's another aspect about how the family units broke down. Some of them went north, some of them went south, and there was that division between the Hatfields and the McCoys.
Mm-hmm. I think it was a personal issue that they had with the family.
Well, you're right about the issues with the families, but it was further antagonized because some of them were Unionists in an area that was mostly Confederate, right? And they had been called out for that.
Well, one of the McCoys did serve for the Union, and he got injured. He's the one, I think, that got killed, actually. But the McCoy Patron, the leader of the family, he was a Confederate and served with Devil Anse Hatfield, but he ended up deserting while Hatfield stayed, right? So there was that part too, where you're a filthy fucking deserter. Like, fuck you.
I mean, it was the families hated each other. Let's just be honest. The families hated each other. They were looking for an excuse to kill each other. They constantly did. I mean, it was clan warfare at its finest, if you want to look at it from that perspective.
Well, no, and everybody laughs because it started over a pig, haha. Well, fuck off, dude. Like, that's what all they had to eat. Like, those hogs meant something to them, fucking folk. You know what I mean?
They did, and it is something that is very true. Is people do underestimate that they are talking things that are at that time could be considered life and death. Just like I said, why did they hang horse thieves? Because if somebody stole your horse, you may die as a result. Okay, that's why. All right, horses were absolutely necessary to live. All right, for some people. All right, back in those days, that's why thievery of a horse was considered so serious. All right, killing a cow was considered less serious than stealing a horse. Now, cattle rustling, all right, was a different story. Killing a single cow, people just kind of like, okay, they ate a cow. That's not right. Pay for the cow. But if you're rustling massive herd of cattle, you could wipe out an entire rancher and his whole family just because you stole the cattle on his land. All right.
Yeah, no, and that's one of the big things Billy the Kid actually did after the Lincoln County War, right? Is he became just a cattle rustler, and he would sell the cows down in Mexico and then come back up and hit.
Right. Well, that's what his lifestyle turned into. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, all this, the Civil War then basically colors what the aftermath color. It colors the rest of the country, and even today, it still does. There are people still whining about it, aka Mad Dodge.
Well, as soon as you let something like that be forgotten and it gets whitewashed by history, then then nobody will remember what really happened.
Well, it isn't people whitewashing history. The problem is now you got these freaking leftists that want to try and whitewash history, even to the point where you got Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador basically saying you need to apologize to Spain and you need to apologize Vatican for what you guys did, all right, to the Native Americans and the indigenous populations.
I'm waiting for the day that we go back.
I enjoyed that. You were talking about cannibalism and shit. And go ahead, Cabby. Sorry.
That we actually really, I mean, if we're going to go back and everything's about reparations, that we go back and we start blaming the people who left the trees, because, I mean, they're the ones who caused the problem originally, right?
God kicked us out of paradise. How dare he do something like that? It was just a joke.
Well, just say, bro.
Don't tase me, bro. Don't tase me.
That's fucked up. Hammered Spud in the chat, Mad Dodge McCoy. I wouldn't have been one of the McCoys, you son of a bitch.
Actually, it does kind of work though, Mad Dodge McCoy. It does sound good. It's got a ring to it.
Oh, here we go.
Got a sound. You like the ring of it. You like the sound of it. Has the import. Has.
Yeah, I like the cut of that.
That's one thing I forgot to bring up though. When Jefferson Davis was sitting in that jail, the Pope actually sent him. He made it by hand. A crown of thorns, and sent it to Jefferson Davis. That's kind of an interesting little tidbit. If you're ever on Jeopardy, you might.
So basically, they were basically the Vatican was trying to interfere with U.S. politics.
Zinger.
If you want to put it that way, I guess.
Well, I mean, it's not an inaccurate assessment, is it?
I actually think the Vatican might have recognized the Confederate government during the war. There is correspondence between Jefferson Davis and the Pope. So,
King dealt with Hitler. They don't give a shit. They're happy whoever fills in, the Vatican banks. As long as you can fill their coffers, they don't give a shit. The Vatican are extremely flexible with their morals.
That's exactly how to look at it too. They're flexible with their morals. Besides, I mean, I'm sure that Jefferson Davis was an altar boy at one point.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I know I'm just making that stuff up, folks. Don't believe that. I just said that just to annoy Mad Dodge.
Yeah, but the weird thing is, it's probably true.
Oh, I don't think he was a Catholic. I don't think Jefferson Davis was a Catholic. But
well, yeah, I mean, an altar boy, you got them in, Protestants. So then Protestants can get married. So, they're out. They don't need to abuse children.
He was just being shared around. Is that what you're thinking? Jefferson Davis was given out on loan several times. No, I don't believe that.
All right. So we got a Streamlabs donation from Jez. $3. Thank you very much. This is from the troops who support the letter U. Okay. All right.
What the fuck is this? Sesame Street? What the fuck?
Hey. If Sesame Street was supporting the South, Mad Dodge would take them. Can you just see Grover out there in a Civil War uniform, right? Fighting for the South.
No. It's gonna be Confederate. It's gonna be animal.
That's a possibility. Animal. So he'd be part
Animal
of
in a Confederate uniform.
No, he'd be in Union because he'd be working for Sherman, and he'd go, "Animal, that way, go." I think we're finished though now, man. You agree? Been going for a little over an hour now.
Yeah, no, we can wrap it up. Yep. I think we should do one more just overview episode next week, and then we're done on the World War I in a couple weeks.
It never ends.
Are you ready to participate in World War I, Cabbage?
No.
No. you don't want to. You don't want to be a part of the discussion.
No, because it'll only end up in arguments.
What arguments would there be?
Well, maybe about late arrival.
Well, that's you trying to poke a freaking argument. That's you wanting to start an argument.
No, yeah, that's just saying.
Yeah, no, we'll just hear the whole time. Yeah, you Americans, you're always fucking late.
Well, see, you see, he understands. That's why I said no.
But you and Jensen will probably have some decent insights, from the British perspective. I mean, you had relatives that served in the World War I that you gave you stories and stuff, right?
Yeah.
So.
Well, my granddad lost his leg, and actually, he was really unlucky. He was in the Somme, and he was moved up to what was the north, even worse. He was meant to be like on a break. He got his fucking leg blown off. Yeah, never the same man again, apparently. I barely remember him, to be honest. I just remember the only thing I of him was him just sitting there in a chair staring. I mean, people talk about 1,000 yards stare what he had, but it was beyond 1,000.
Well, about at that point in time, I mean, how much of it was his experience, and how much of it was the war? How much of it was?
I know, it was shell shock and everything. I mean, you got to imagine that you haven't slept for in trenches, and you got constant bombardment coming in. I mean, it's not. I mean, imagine what it's like having sleep deprivation for let alone months.
Yeah.
It's got to fuck with your head, especially when it's all everything's blowing up and you don't know if the next boom is going to be you.
Some of the pictures of those guys with shell shock, and they got that crazy eyes like AOC, and the fucking big smile. Like, holy fuck!
Oh, seriously, that was like my granddad. I bet he just had that eyes weird, just no kind. It's like just vacant. There's nothing there. It's really odd, honestly. It's not something I'd like to see again.
Unfortunately, guys, though, I've got to get going. So.
Yeah, no, we're gonna wrap it up here. Thank you everybody for coming out. Thank you, Jez, for the donation. We'll be back around tomorrow. We'll see what's in the news. Is Theresa May dead yet? Or did she at least step down? You'll find out tomorrow.
Wishful thinking.
Good night, everybody. Later.